their children. I've encouraged people, women in particular, bring your children to court. We'll accommodate them. And what he was trying to do is get all of the counties to have children's centers in every courtroom, in every courthouse, including, and I've had people come in, men and women, with their 3 to 5 children on jury duty. They simply don't have child care facilities. And I think our system has to change in that regard.
Any other observations? I think these are exactly the, yes, go ahead, sir.
I was going to say that, I'll go back, I think, of course, the demeanor of the bailiff, the action of the bailiff is huge. And I remember a mentor judge once told me that the demeanor of the bailiff will often dictate how your day goes. You know, if you have a bailiff who is just not fair, who is tough, not reasonable, your day is going to be a tough day, because obviously the defendants who are appearing before you, they kind of see what possibly is going to be the case. So, anyways, I go back to that a lot.
And do you have much choice over who your bailiff is?
They have trainings and so forth.
Yeah, we pick our own bailiffs.
So they're just assigned in some. So it varies by county, it sounds like, whether or not.
From my experience, the same bailiffs have been in the same courtrooms. I've been in with the same judges. But to follow up on part of that, when I was looking at your list, of course, one of the things happening, I'm thinking what worse is the people that present sometimes and know that they've gone out of bounds. The anxiety level prior to them appearing, my phone goes off the hook. It's about, it's, I call it the Hail Mary pass. And they're, oh my God, I'm going to get remanded, and then watching the effects of that on the people. After that, you just hear the hush behind me, because I'm sitting up in front here. Oh my God, you just hear the hush forward about what's going on at that time now. And then we live, because again, they're going in and out of the system. One of the things that I did notice, to go back to when we were talking about it, the reaction of the team with frustrating clients. Because the first knee-jerk reaction is that usually there's cool heads, some cool heads, but when there's mental health overlay, frustration with their behaviors, they're not doing what we want them to do, they're not showing up, it's like, okay, put them in jail. Is the first reaction. That's what they know how to do. Relate to what you were talking about. It's like, that's what they know how to do. They know how to lie. That's the reactions that come, and how do you address that so you can build a working relationship with them. And our judge, and we've had several, which is kind of who's the problem with that, but lately we've had the same one. She calls people by their first name. They're coming up, she asks them, what are you doing, how's your kids? She knows the kids' names. She knows that they're in school. She keeps notes of all of that stuff. She asks them, how's it going for you? It makes her want to work. It's not like you're in and out. She asks them how you are doing to build a personal relationship, so they know that, and she's been very clear about this, is when you lie or you do something that's on that court list, it's a sacred thing. We're trying to be consistent in that way. It's not always going to be that you're remanded and you're going to be jail time. It's about community service. It's about changing our response to it as providers, because that first knee-jerk reaction when I work with somebody who's really frustrating is baloney. I don't want to deal with them. I want to say, you're very difficult. But I try to keep an even keel on that. So that's what I had to say. Thanks.
Yes.
They support how the prosecutor's like. It's always nice to hear nice things come out of the prosecutor. You're doing a good job. I'm proud of you. Continue. And so it's nice to have that prosecutor there to say some nice things, because that also gives the individual a sense of progress and what have you. So
well, it is a collaborative, and that's certainly, I know in California, they're actually called collaborative courts. I mean, that's the phrase that's given And that's not, I mean, that's not a mistake. You know, they didn't draw names out of a hat. I mean, there is a reason why, and that means the prosecutor, the defense attorney, the judge, everybody, as you mentioned, the team. It is more, that isn't, as you all know, that is not the way justice is, you know, is done in the rest of the courtrooms. And I think that collaboration piece is huge.
There's a couple of things. Oh, yeah, okay. A couple of things that, you know, these courts are, it's different than a regular criminal court. There's a paternalistic or a maternalistic, as the case may be, you know, whoever the judge is, component to this. And everybody is part of, I mean, it's kind of like a semi-family to some extent. Having said that, there is a certain structure that has to be provided to these individuals. You know, and you mentioned earlier, well, you know, maybe have them show up late for court. I mean, that's, in most courtrooms, it's just not realistic. You've got to hold them accountable for their actions. I mean, at some point, you know, I get the trauma-based, you know, deal here. I mean, I've been in the military, I've been a cop, I've seen a lot of things in 18 years as a prosecutor. I've done everything from prosecuting 415s to first-degree murder, and I've seen just done juvenile and everything else. And some of the things that I've noticed is that in this type of a court, you have to hold them accountable for their actions. You have to understand, you know, certain things that go on with them, but you have to have a structure, and you got to hold them to it. Because if you give free passes here and there and everywhere, they're gonna take advantage of it. But you also have to be able to understand there's a balancing that you have to, to use there. And so I like giving. I'm in Judge Laverado's courtroom. I like giving positive feedback. I do think it works, and you give them an attaboy when they do well, and then when it's time for, you know, he always asks, well, what do you think, Mr. Prosecutor? And it's like, well, I think we need a remand. But we don't do remands for 40 or 50 days. You know, in the final analysis, if somebody's just blown through everything and there's nothing we can do, okay, now there's prison or whatever, a long jail sentence. But for the most of the time, it's a remand for a certain amount of time. Give them a wake-up call, give them a hot test, or give them a urine test. If it comes up hot, you know, this is what's going to happen. It's kind of hard to lie when, you know, it's like, here's your hot test. You know, well, it's not me. I didn't do it. Well, yeah, you're going to jail. So you might as well tell the truth. Right. Let's quit playing games, and you hold them accountable for their actions. And I think it works. I can't tell you how many people have come, and I've been there for about 4 months now, when they graduate from drug court, and Judge Laverado asks them, well, what did you take away from this experience? What did you learn? And to a person, they almost all say, it's the structure. It's my daily structure. I've learned how to structure my life. I've learned to identify certain triggers and how to deal with that. I mean, and to me, it's huge. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
In the back.
I just wanted to say, when the judge from Monterey County was speaking about the bailiffs and the bailiff's attitude, that I worked in a juvenile drug court where the judge purchased candy bars and the bailiff was in charge of throwing them to the kids who had done well. And it was it created a very, and none of these kids had been traumatized by throwing objects. We made sure of that.
Okay.
When I came to work in the court that I'm in, I came from healthcare and didn't know much about the structure of a courthouse or a courtroom, or made lots of mistakes. But one thing that's interesting is, as long as drug courts have been around, for the most part, the people who work in the court see them as some kind of orphan kind of court that does things a little differently. And so I'm finding that the administrators of the program, and as someone was mentioning, we don't have any choice in the bailiffs. And I've gotten pretty hot under the collar a few times because of the way the bailiffs have treated the people and have gone looking for their supervisor to talk to them. So many of us have a lot of education for the rest of the court to really get them to understand what it is we do. Even in our courthouse, people don't know the success that we have. When I share with them the percentage of people that don't go back through the revolving door and how important things like the trauma, looking at things through the trauma lens, then they go, oh, that makes sense. So we really even have to start at home.
And drug courts and mental health courts have about the equal success rates. I mean, if you look at the outcome studies, and they look very different from one another. It's not like there's one way. But there's some formula, something chemistry, something going on, regardless of who the judge is, and there's something, the success rates are pretty consistent. Judge Manley had a comment over here.
Yeah, I was just going to offer the thought that what I have noted when you talk about trauma and the effects of trauma, particularly I find with parolees, those who have been through a great deal, there is not only a resistance to treatment, but a readiness to quit at all times. And I can't think of a day that we do not have participants who they would rather serve more time. I had one this week who is on parole for 3 additional years, would rather serve the entire time on parole in jail than stay out in the community in treatment. And I think a lot of it is when the team recognizes it, as we try to, and work in convincing that person to stay in treatment and to believe in themselves, and that they can overcome things. And at times I have found it is a good strategy to ask the offender, what can you do when we're not getting anywhere, and then give them an opportunity to see if they can at least do that, and put it on them to design their own plan.
Yeah, I would just like to build on the formula and kind of expand a little bit on the word structure. I like to swap the word structure out with consistency. I haven't heard that word yet within our drug court. Consistency, the accountability, and just the consistency with our approach. And I think with those two approaches, the formula is a positive end result.
Okay. One more over here, and then we've got about 8 minutes left.
Just to sort of build on what Judge Manley was saying, I also work with a parolee population, and I think that there's this, at least from my perspective, there's this sort of belief that if we build it, they will come. So if we just have more treatment programs, then that's going to solve the problem. But I think that there's this kind of chronic, pervasive, distorted thought process that happens with this population where they would rather do their time than do treatment. And one of the things I think to be mindful of is to not impose our own beliefs or values about what is going to give them the life that we think that they should have, as opposed to what is it that's going to work for you here? Do you want your parole agent off your ass? And how are you going to do that? And so that, as opposed to, well, wouldn't you like to be a more productive member of society? I think that's a lovely idea, but it's not always going to be the most effective thing with that population.
And I've had this conversation many times, and we could talk all day about that. What does it mean to be successful in a treatment court program? Because what we may think is success, it's all of those things, but for some people that may be out of reach for a variety of reasons, and they end up dropping out, quitting, being terminated, what have you, because the program, and I'm not saying oh, you don't have to do anything, but sometimes our expectations are just not reachable, and there's just more treatment. That'd be better, more treatment. Well, they don't have time to go to more treatment. Programs can be very demanding, and I think sometimes like asking what you can do is probably a good approach.
To piggyback on Judge Manley, as a graduate, it's easier to say I'm going to do the time rather than doing the program. Why? Because you don't have to answer to anybody. You don't have to explain why you're late. You don't have to explain why you tested dirty, why you didn't feel like following the rules or following the program that one day. It's easier. And a lot of offenders tend to get in trouble on purpose because they're living in the society that normal people do. It's too hard. It's too hard. You have to keep a job. You have to be a parent. If you're a parent, it's many reasons for why people or offenders tend to fall back on the easiest way out, which is maxing out. To me, the program helped. It makes you enter back into society and not be a menace, but contribute or give your story and help someone else. Yeah, it's going to take some hard work, but what doesn't? So that's the answer to why people choose to do the time rather than doing the program. It's easier. But once it clicks, once that person, judge, DA, or counselor hit that one spot in the offender, that's it. That's when it clicks, and that's when you decide to get out
They can really change the mood in the court. They can make things happen or stop things from happening. The mental health court in a community in Illinois, they have a drug court and a mental health court, a lot of them, but in this particular community, which I will not identify, the same judge is over the mental health court and the drug court. He was imposing the drug court conditions and policies and the more structure on the mental health court, and the prosecutor objected. The prosecutor said, you can't put someone in jail for not taking their therapeutic medications. And the judge refused to change, and so the prosecutor pulled the plug on the mental health court. The prosecutor did that, not the public defender. So I think that it's, the judges can really, can drive, or they're driving the car here. They're really the ones who can make this. Changing the language. How many of you are, I'm not asking your age, how many of you can remember back during the Ramirez brothers' trial for killing their parents? And do you remember what the phrase was that the media used all the time? About the defense they were using? The abuse excuse. That was the phrase that was used. It was all over the newspapers. Think about what that means. Menendez brothers, yes, thank you. But think about what that means. The abuse excuse. How might you make that trauma-informed? That's about as untrauma-informed as you can get, right? So changing the language from being trauma, it's about traumatic events, traumatic experiences. Leading the community language around that is really important. And it may sound like it's really simple, but it may be simple to do, but it's very important. The language we use to describe events has profound experience. It changes the way a community will, in a courtroom, and the programs then will. I know a judge who actually calls treatment providers in and holds them in contempt of court for not following through on the treatment that was ordered. They don't do that very often. I mean, he'll call them in. He holds them in contempt of court. So, and they show up. Funny how that is. They get subpoenaed. Yes, sir. No? Yes. No. They did not. I mean, California's had some of the more interesting, the Twinkie defense. Remember that with Dan White? Yeah. Okay. But the language, the language is so important. And for judges to be able to lead not just their own court, but their colleagues' court, and start talking about the importance of this is really critical. It's an important way to moving toward having a trauma-informed court. Yes, sir?
Oh, I was just going to comment about language. I've had some the demeanor or language coming out of bailiffs in the court, and these bailiffs are rotating sheriffs. They're out in the field working with these people, so they see the other side of these people before they're in drug court. And it seems like through the whole process, they just kind of hold them in that box. And I've actually, I don't know for sure, but I think the judge ordered that bailiff shall not be in this courtroom anymore. I don't know if that's the true answer, but I don't see the guy anymore in my courtroom.
Well, that's a perfect segue into the next part we want to talk about, is how the system, throughout the system, re-traumatizes people. Because courts are not the end of the road by any means, but you're paying the price for what the arrest looked like, and what their booking looked like, and what their days in jail looked like. Did they get their medication? Were they strip searched? You're paying the price because they're going to come to court with all those cumulative experiences just for this one arrest. And that is something which, then when you have a bailiff who perhaps is triggering, maybe the shaking of the handcuffs, or can really cause re-traumatization in your courtroom that had nothing really to do with what's going on there so much, but everything that came before that. We've all watched enough television. You've all been involved in the system long enough to know that there are ways for police officers to arrest somebody, and there are ways for them to use a trauma-informed arrest. They have procedures. Police officers have procedures they have to follow. And Officer Tully, in fact, it's interesting when sometimes we have police officers, they say, well, she violated procedure, that's why she got shot. There are procedures for an arrest, but there are ways to handcuff people that are less traumatizing than others. Okay, there are ways of speaking to, not misusing authority, explaining what's going to happen next. For people who've never been arrested before, they have no idea what's going to happen next. It's humiliating, it's scary, you don't know whether you're ever going to see, and you've watched way too much TV, you have no idea what's going to happen, whether you're going to be able to call anybody, who's going to watch your kids? You're on your way to school to pick up your kids. I mean, those are all flashes that are going on in people's minds during an arrest. And so if you think about ways in which a police officer can shape his or her way of just patting someone down. Sometimes people feel like they've been completely manually raped by the time they've gotten through a pat down. And explaining I have to handcuff you as procedure, and then we'll talk as soon as you're in handcuffs, not other ways that it could be done. And you can imagine how this can trigger some pretty aggressive reactions from people who are scared to death. Okay, you can imagine how this can trigger along the way. And when people go into jail, just the fact of being confined, just the fact of being searched, being strip searched, drug testing, etc. All of that is, you can do it in a trauma-informed way. It usually involves information, explaining, this is what we need to do next, and this is what's going to happen to you when you go into the next point. That's the point at which you're going to be able to call your family, or that's the point at which you're going to be able to call a friend. But you can imagine, you know how easily authority can be misused in this situation. And people who come in with substance abuse problems and with mental health problems are the last people that the jailers want to have come in. Okay, and so the whole situation is extremely stressful for everyone, including the people who work there. Probation officers, again, can be, what's the biggest fear that people have who are on probation? I mean, with regard to the justice system. They're going to violate you and you're going back to jail. Okay, and so the kinds of consequences of, say, a violation, is every violation equal? Some probation officers have it in for people. Some probation officers just violate everybody. And others are more flexible in those consequences. Maybe they know that Jim's father died over the weekend. I sat in on a hearing in one of our adult treatment court collaborative programs in Texas, and one of the men had not shown up. He wasn't where he was supposed to be when his probation officer went to check on him. And the reaction was almost immediately they needed to send out police to find him, until his caseworker said his son committed suicide last night. The response changed immediately. The judge said, please send his caseworker, send his probation officer, please go find him to make sure he's okay. I mean, that was just, he was still in violation because he wasn't where he didn't check in, but his son had committed suicide the night before. So having that information, responding differently, can change the outcome completely in both in his life and certainly in the way in which it's handled. Okay, what do you do in the courts that maybe can be re-traumatizing? Now we have to talk about the police, what they do, what the jail does, probation. As you're thinking about your procedures, what kinds of procedures do you have, or that other court that you've sat in on, doesn't have to be yours, that may be re-traumatizing now that you think about it? Yes? Okay, you lose your voice. Your public defender speaks on your behalf. Do any of you ever have clients who want to speak themselves? Wouldn't you? Because how well, in many cases, does the public defender know the client? We are working on a study right now exactly on that. We're looking at the relationship between public defenders and clients with mental illness and what they think of the other. I think they have such low expectations of their attorney that any kind of communication is going to be perceived positively. I think it'd be interesting to find out the results from that. What else? Yes?
We have a domestic violence court, and I just think the whole system of getting a restraining order is very traumatizing. When you have a victim having to file for the restraining order, come to court date, stand at the table next to their abuser, and tell the judge, yes, I want a restraining order for him, and then be able to leave and walk out without the fear of the consequences of just getting a restraining order.
Okay. So sometimes the legal procedures are themselves can be re-traumatizing. And being in court with, and as I mentioned earlier, the little children who have to testify in court about, and I understand that the accused have a right to confront their accuser. I mean, that's sort of one of those, but this is one of the consequences of that. What else do programs do? Yes, sir.
I think one of the things that re-traumatizes folks with trauma is in the court system is the structure of courts. We're very structured: time, hour, date. Drug courts on Monday. Veterans courts on Tuesday. DUI treatment courts on Wednesday at 8:30. And so what happens is that people who are in these courts don't have that structure in their lives, and so it's the traditional round peg in the square hole, and we're going to beat the crap out of this thing until it fits. And so, one of the things in my veterans court, I encourage the veterans in my court to do is say, I only see you all once a week, but you can come in, or once every other week, and you can come and see me any day if you're in crisis, and we'll figure it out. It'll take just a couple of minutes, and I'll plug you into the right place, because I'm busy. I've got trials, I've got prelims, I've got other stuff going on, but I will help you. This door is open for you. And it changes the whole, the whole dynamic of how courts are. Now, it's a real pain in the butt to do that, because, I might be in the middle of a prelim and I see a vet walk in, but, we'll get the public defender over to talk to him and the probation officer and the DA and, hey, what's going on over here? And then when we take a break, we will figure this thing out. But it really changes the dynamic between the court system, not necessarily the judge, but the entire system, and this individual whose life might be flaming out on a Wednesday when his court date's not until next Friday, And so, that I think it's that structure that traumatizes. And how do we make it flexible enough to help people when they're in crisis?
I heard flexibility, choice, responsiveness. I mean, those are all key to becoming trauma-informed. I've heard some treatment courts, because of the structure, and sometimes public transportation doesn't work the way it's supposed to, or you don't have the money for it, giving a day. Like Tuesday's going to be court day between 8 and 4. Show up sometime during the day. You don't have to be there at 8:15, or you've missed your hearing, which is very hard for courts to have that because they're very structured in the time, etc. But it may make people feel like they have some choice in the matter. They could get something done earlier in the day, or maybe they just can't get up in the morning, and they're not in violation. But that's, I think, our legal system itself is very structured. But that's really interesting. I'm sure that even if they don't come, they know they can. What are some other ways? Yeah, Kathleen.
Just the fact that women are such a minority in the criminal justice system, and everything from courts to jails to programs are really geared towards the men. And even for the women going to court, 99% of the women have experienced trauma, and a lot of them by men. And so they're forced to have to constantly be, 1 in 10. And it's a hard one structurally to fix, but I think it's something really to look at.
I think that raises a really important point in terms of communicating with the treatment providers too. It's very common, and it's actually fairly successful for people with substance abuse disorders and trauma. For example, seeking safety plus a 12-step program is shown to be pretty successful, both in reducing trauma, PTSD symptoms, and also reducing substance use. there's a lot of communities that don't have single-sex 12-step programs. And so you're ordered to go to a 12-step program, or it's at night and it's three blocks from the bus. And it triggers, and people aren't going to comply with that. Being aware of that, there's certain circumstances under which, like you say, all the programs are directed, 1 in 10 of the people in the justice system are women, so you go with the majority. I've heard this in domestic violence cases. You mentioned it in terms of both being there, but also then having the provider who's providing services to both are in the same building with basically the same waiting room. And so they run the risk of running into either their victim or their perpetrator just in getting treatment. Any other things we do?
Structure's never been part of their life. I mean, all the way from a childhood, supervision, structure, and none of that. Court system relies on structure. So these people are intimidated, and that intimidation turns into fear. And then once the fear is hit, there's the challenge.
Chief Ronald George came to our court in Monterey County, and he encouraged the system to change when it comes to people on drug problems, mental health, that are still functional, maybe mid, and then bringing
it's a process, and drug court provides that for you to feel free to open up to the counselors, even to the judge, to become a better person.
Thank you.
I would just like to add, you can be trauma-informed and trauma-aware, but as a provider, you still need to hold that client accountable. You just being aware of what's going on, but accountability is what's going to help them stay sober and move to the next level. So,
Well, I think that's, and I know that that NDCI and NADCP talk about that. Part of it is being flexible with consequences, and we're going to talk about that, because people who do want to start being truthful, they don't know what the consequence of that necessarily is going to be. And that's very, very scary. That's very dangerous. But if it's in cases where you know someone has been consistently lying to you about, say, drug screens, if in the moment that they're truthful with you, if they're then punished, well, say put in jail, then why would they be truthful again? You know, it's that accountability. It's a very, very, very thin line to walk between accountability and is the way that you put a judge, being codependent. It's a very difficult walk to take, because at least in many people's past, lying has been very dangerous. Lying or truth telling has been dangerous. Excuse me. And so now it's easier. You said you lied to protect yourself for a very, very long time. So it is very hard to know that difference between accountability and therapy, sort of getting people to be truthful.
and we always tell them, play the whole tape through. Lying will get you for a moment, but if you play it all the way through, then you're more accountable. So that's why they kept having her go back to say, oops, I'm lying, let me start over. Because we know the end result is when you play the whole tape through in your head, you're going to be aware of this is only going to be a temporary solution. My lying will get me through, but next week when I come back to take the drug test, somebody may be different. And so that's where it's a process. It's a long process to get them there, but it works.
Yes.
This is just sort of not quite sure where to start, but I've been working for public mental health agencies for about 14 years with justice-involved adults, and when we talk about mental health care in treatment courts, I think there's a broader population of people that really do need that type of mental health services, but public mental health agencies, at least at the two agencies I've worked for, their target population are the seriously mentally ill, so schizophrenia, bipolar, schizoaffective disorder, and we don't tend to take in individuals into treatment for mental health care with PTSD or severe depression. And it's a huge population of people that are really falling through the cracks with regards to mental health care, and I don't see that necessarily changing, even with counties implementing trauma-informed services.
I think it's an excellent point. And until recently, PTSD was considered an anxiety disorder. And in many jurisdictions, state mental health funds you can't pay for treating certain disorders, only the psychoses really. And with people with trauma histories, it's much more comorbid with depression and other like OCD, obsessional compulsive disorder, dissociation, that not with schizophrenia and schizoaffective. So, and again, many states limit the public dollars that can treat anything but the major mental illnesses. And this is the population that you're specifically talking about. I don't know what will happen in the states. This is good lobbying opportunity for all of you. With DSM-5, they've created a totally separate diagnostic category for stress-related disorders. It's totally separate. It's interesting. They acknowledge that sexual abuse is considered an event that could trigger PTSD. That's never been explicitly spelled out in the DSM before. So that's the biggest area of change in the whole DSM is around stress and trauma-related disorders. It's its own category now. So, I mean, this is an opportunity, really, and while everybody's deciding, what's Medicaid, reimbursable, et cetera, that doesn't exist right now in your state formula. So here's an opportunity, especially if you can show evidence-based practices where people benefit from receiving these services. But it's an open question what's going to happen as states then start to adopt the DSM-5, which just came out, I think, in May. Yes? Okay, let's move on next then to trauma-informed responses. And this is where I want you to really turn the lens inward, not just you, but your group, your court, your programs, your treatment providers. As I said, there are treatment providers that are client-resistant. And I think that this has been said by a number of different people, but keeping in mind that I heard the word respect, and you hear that a lot among people who've been successful in treatment courts, is one of the most important changes for them is the judge knew their name. Actually called them by their name. Instead of, hey, you are the 13 seconds that you might get in a typical arraignment or a typical hearing. The judge knows their name, they know their children's names, they know when they're going to classes or what kind of classes, what their interests are, who their friends are. It's pretty basic, calling someone by their name and knowing them. But for many people, especially people who've gone through the criminal justice system multiple times, it's the first time anyone has ever showed them respect. And one of the things that I think, there's sort of some keys to, and we also it's on here as well. So this is part of the take-home message of that, is that people need to feel safe. People need to feel safe to tell the truth. Okay, people need to feel like they have choice, and that's part of that accountability piece. That they may choose to violate their conditions, but there will be but it was their choice to do that. That they need to be trusted, and also trust the people, the providers, their caseworkers, etc. And it basically comes down to human respect. I'll just give you an example, and I will deny if anybody. I'm not going to tell you where this was. But if you can figure it out, I'm going to deny it, this story, okay, completely. We were visiting a treatment court, a mental health court, and it happened to be a misdemeanor court. And the judge wanted to meet with us, with a number of the court staff. So we were there on time. We met for what turned out to be longer, and it was before lunch. It was like now, like 11 o'clock or something. Court was supposed to start at 11. And the conversation just kept going on and on and on. The court was already late to start. So the court officer went out and announced that everybody would have to come back in the afternoon because a meeting had run over. And there are 25 people sitting there who've taken the day off if they found childcare, taken public transportation, and they're just now being told they just wasted their entire morning, and now they have to waste their entire afternoon. I felt so complicit in that. I felt it was so disrespectful. And I think sometimes we're accustomed to, being able to do that. We can cancel appointments, telling people we'll be on time, making them be on time and then be late. That's just disrespectful. I felt really, as I said, complicit in that. It was vocally unappreciated by the people who were there. So I think that sometimes that some real basic, how many of you have ever waited at a doctor's office for an appointment? And you're real happy, right? Like, doesn't this person appreciate my time? It's also true with people whose lives may not seem as busy as ours, but just basic respect, giving people a choice for when they come. I'm always finding, as I mentioned, I do some work with juvenile mental health courts. Why do they hold court during the day? These are kids who have truancy issues anyway. And now you're telling them, oh, you can skip school today and come to court. They come to court, for sure. They're so happy not to go to school, they'll just say that. It's great. I love Tuesday because it's court day. I don't have to go to school. So those are the kind. It seems like it's built in, sort of a mixed message, shall we say? One of the other, and this is a bit the example I told about the judge making everybody come back in the afternoon as well. People who work in the criminal justice system have a lot of authority and a lot of power. And we can overuse it and misuse it. Can you think of some ways, just maybe even subtle ways, other than being late for appointments, that you can maybe misuse your authority? Not that you did it, but you know somebody who did. What are some ways? Yeah.
Why did you do that?
Yeah, tone of voice and the word choice. Yelling, just saying, "Why did you do that?" What else?
Threatening.
Okay, threatening. You can even do that non-verbally, can't you? How can you make someone feel uncomfortable? Oh, clicking your handcuffs? Yeah. Yeah, disapproval, rolling your eyes, talking when they're talking, staring, body posture, getting too close to people. Those are intimidating behaviors. And the question is it necessary? Is that a misuse of authority? Yes?
One of my clients was telling me that our judge chooses to stand up instead of just sit down and, I'm loud. No, she was. Okay. Yeah, so she stands up, and my clients came after court and said, "Why did she stand up? It's so intimidating."
Well, the courtroom itself is intimidating. Some of you may be in treatment courts where you've sort of disassembled the traditional dais, in that. Some treatment courts have become less formal in that respect, that the judge doesn't even wear a robe. Okay, that in itself, there's a whole setup to that. Another way in which defendants are really disrespected is the privacy issues. Especially, I know that's a real dicey thing with a lot of public defenders in particular. Information that is discussed in, let's say, a collaborative team that may be information that is not in the best interest for the prosecutor to know or the judge to know. And that's a real difficult thing. The whole privacy issue is something that treatment courts have difficulty with. Some judges sit in on the hearings or the team meetings, some judges don't. Okay, but I think it's not overusing and inappropriately using authority, but instead responding to what's being done, not reacting to what's being done. Not yelling. Okay, not yelling. But I think that if you keep in mind the difference in the words respond and react, if you think about that, and you know what the fact is, you're not going to like people who are on your caseload or in your court. Do you have any of those? But it's about their behavior. I know that's like child rearing 101. You're told that all the time. It's not. I'm just responding to your behavior, not to you. Well, it's true with adults as well. Okay, it's true with adults as well. It's the behavior, it's not the person. You don't have to like the people who you are supervising. But the question is whether or not you're treating them with respect and creating the environment where you can have a trauma-informed set of policies and procedures and behaviors that go along with that. You may have coworkers who you just don't think are on their game. And that's something which all personnel issues are always hard to deal with. But so how do we respond to the different outcomes, concrete outcomes of trauma histories? How do we respond to substance abuse? How do we help people who have relationship problems because of their trauma histories? These are just some suggestions. These are just a few little tidbits that both NADCP and we've talked about. Being flexible with consequences. Attending funerals, for example. Giving people a flexibility when, let's say that they can't make a court date because they have some event that they want to go to. Sometimes the lockstep programs and conditions really tie our hands about being really responding as we would, and instead they become more reactive. And when I mentioned earlier, thinking about, and this is what I kind of want you to turn your lens in, what are we doing out of habit? Or what are we doing because it's easier? Is this really the right response to this individual set of circumstances? And you can't have a cookie cutter. The treatment courts are they're the antithesis of cookie cutter justice. They are the antithesis of that. That's why they were created. Was because that doesn't work for people who have very complex lives. Treatment courts are, by definition, getting us to be trauma-informed. Because judges got sick and tired of people coming back with the same problems over and over and over and over again, that revolving door. Judges came up with treatment courts. Providers did not come up with treatment courts. And in your community, they will succeed based upon the commitment of the judge. In my next life, I'm coming back as a judge. I decided I've done enough of this because people actually return your phone calls, or come to a meeting. If it comes on a judge's letterhead or a judge makes a phone call, you get just amazing responses. This is a researcher calling from New York. Would you call me back? Right. But if you can get a judge to call on your behalf, the phone's ringing before you hang it up. So judges can really change the conversation.